Hey everyone, and welcome back to What's the Plan, the podcast where we dive into the matters of our careers in the architecture and urban planning field. I'm Hayley.
And I'm Andrea. So, Hayley, what's the plan this week?
This week's plan is all about the Toronto Transit Commission, otherwise known as the TTC, the public transport agency that operates bus, subway, streetcars, and paratransit services in Toronto and into some areas of York Region, which is where we live.
Including ours, yeah.
The TTC is owned and managed by the City of Toronto, and it is the oldest and largest urban service provider in the Greater Toronto Area.
Yeah, so you can tell its age when you go to some of the stations, especially located on the edge of the city. So, although the TTC owns and operates over 149 bus routes, 11 streetcar lines, and 75 subway stations, the subway system itself is quite limited as there are only actually 4 rapid transit lines. So the 4 lines are Line 1, being the Young University line, and for those visually minded listeners out there, that is the yellow line. And this yellow line is a U-shaped, mostly north to south line, and it was opened in 1954 and last extended in 2017, which we will touch upon later. Line 2, known as the Bloor-Danforth line, or the Green Line, is an east-west line opened in 1966, and it was last extended in 1980, which is a long time ago.
A long time.
Line 3, known as Scarborough, or Blue, is a partly elevated rail train, which was opened in 1985, and that connects to the most eastern terminus of the Bloor-Danforth line. And the final line is Line 4, Shepherd, which is also known as Purple, and this opened in 2002. So pre-pandemic, on average, the TTC serves, or the subway system itself serves 1,034,000 people a day, which was about 50% of all TTC trips made daily. So that's quite a lot of people to be on only 4 transit lines. That being said, no matter what time of the day, or what day of the week, the subway is never not occupied. Therefore, it is in dire need of an expansion. So, before we go into the proposals to expand the subway system, Hayley, how would you describe your experience with the TTC? What is good and what is bad?
In terms of the subway and streetcar services, I would definitely say it's a convenient form of travel when it's not during rush hour.
For sure.
The frequency of both of these services, I think, are so convenient because from my experience, I've never really had to wait any more than 10 minutes on a regular day for the next vehicle. And so it's really comforting to know when I'm waiting for a bus, when I'm waiting for a streetcar or a subway, it doesn't matter what time I get there. It doesn't matter if I get there and I just see one leave. I don't have to wait, or I usually don't have to wait more than 10 minutes for the next one to arrive, which is really good for being time conscious. But with that being said, because I've never lived in Toronto, I've never had to rely on the TTC on a regular basis. But there were a few times where I had to use the subway during the morning rush hour, and man, when I tell you that is a terrifying experience, I am not exaggerating. It honestly feels like I am a sheep in a flock being herded onto the most cramped space possible. And for someone like me, I just felt so suffocated. And you know how it's a stereotype for Canadians to be so polite and courteous? Well, in that moment, it felt like I was somewhere else. It's just everyone's fighting for themselves and just trying to get a space on the subway, and that is definitely the bad parts of the TTC.
Yeah, it's sort of do or die. You got to know where you're going and you got to commit to it, or else you're just gonna get pushed by the mob.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to get to your destination, you need to fight for it.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. So as a casual rider, going out and about in Toronto, the subway system works great. It comes roughly every 3 to 6 minutes, so even faster than the every 10 minutes of say a streetcar, and it does its job by moving you around the core. However, I think where it misses the mark is when you need to get beyond the core of Toronto, beyond downtown, beyond any transit hub, especially during rush hour. So, like, whether that is from, like, Scarborough, from, like, North York, Vaughan, Etobicoke, from, like, the outskirts of, or the edges of the city, because there are only 4 lines, like, it is always packed during rush hour.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a long time to get from, like, the edge of the neighborhood to the center. So it's like, if you go from the edge of our subway system, if you look at the map, it takes at least 1 hour to get from, like, the very edge into, like, the middle part. And then to have to, like, go to your additional destination is, like, an additional time frame. So this is like not even taking account to the buses or the rail trains that people have to take to get to the subway stations in the first place. So like overall, the subway system is just too small to service all of Toronto.
Yeah, definitely. I think also the design of the subway is so focused on the downtown core that even though it is a service for the city of Toronto, I feel like the subway neglects most parts of the city of Toronto as it focuses only on the downtown, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, and especially when you compare the subway map to like major cities like New York, London, and Hong Kong, our subway looks really pathetic.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But however, there's good news. Expansions. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so we know that the TTC comprises of more than just the subway, but for the purposes of this episode, we're going to be mostly talking about the subway system. So with that, let's get into a little bit of the history of the system. So 1954, which was 67 years ago, was when the Yonge subway first opened, but it only stretched from Eglinton to Union Station. So that is only a very small portion of what the Yonge subway line looks like today. From that point on, within every few years, the TTC would announce line extensions, station openings, and additional lines until Line 4, the Shepherd Line, was opened in 2002. After 15 years with no subway extensions, the TTC finally opened the Toronto-York-Spadina subway extension in 2017, which was a decade-long project. This project involved an 8.6-kilometer extension on the northwestern side of the existing subway Line 1, which included 6 new stations along the route. The goal was to extend the subway system from Downsview Station in Toronto into the Vaughan Corporate Centre in the regional municipality of York. So given that this extension would represent the first rapid transit project to ever break the city of Toronto limits, it was pretty groundbreaking. I remember hearing about it in the news and thinking, wow, I can now ride the subway and not be in the city of Toronto. As someone that grew up in the suburbs, Andrea, would you agree that when you heard that news, it was pretty exciting?
Yeah, it is, because especially since like there is a lot of Toronto beyond Downsview Station. So like being able to reach those points, like say York University, which is in Toronto and like bordering York Vaughan, it's like that was an additional place that you can go through subway. You didn't have to rely on the bus or like rely on a car to get there.
Yeah, for sure. And so the project was officially approved in April of 2008 and construction began in November 2009. With an estimated completion date by late 2015, $2.6 billion was budgeted, but as the project went on, due to frequently changing station design plans, project management issues, poor contractor performance, and even a death of a worker at the York University station site, in combination of harsh winter weather, the project had gone over budget and the Toronto City Council approved an additional $150 million in funding.
It's a big yikes.
Big yikes. By January 2016, the original cost of the project grew from $2.6 billion to about $3.2 billion. And on Sunday, December 17th, 2017, about 2 years after the proposed completion of the project, the Toronto-York-Spadina subway extension was officially open to the public. Now, with any type of new development, this extension didn't prove to be any different in terms of criticism that it received. And with that being said, the largest criticism that was put forth was surrounding the fact that the project would stretch past the boundaries of Toronto. A large reason as to why this was considered a critique was because the projected population densities in Vaughan didn't seem to justify the extension into the area due to funding concerns, who would be in charge of funding, and so forth. And as of now, the ridership recorded at the news stations is still well below average usage, which might have proved the critique to be correct. But with plans to promote higher density developments in Vaughan, we can only hope that this extension will prove to be worth it as time goes on.
Yeah, so another part of that criticism is like by extending to Vaughan, you were addressing another city without addressing like people within your own city. So today we'll be looking into 3 different extensions. The first one being the Yonge North Subway extension, the second being the Scarborough LRT, and the third being the Ontario line. So starting with the Yonge North Subway extension. So York Region is home to many of Canada's fastest growing municipalities outside of Toronto, and it is one of Ontario's largest business communities. So in their opinion, to sustain economic growth and reduce greenhouse gas emissions created by the bus trips that is needed to connect from their transit hub to the subway line, the need for the Yonge Subway extension is quite vital, especially to create further fluidity with the downtown core. And it should be noted that the project that is currently known as the Yonge North Subway Extension is actually proposed by the government in Ontario. However, it is a near identical to the existing planned Yonge Subway Extension that was proposed by the City of Toronto, Metrolinx, and York Region a couple of years ago. And as you listen throughout this episode, this idea of like the province taking and co-opting an existing project will be a running theme. So the northward extension of the Yonge subway line, beyond its current terminus, which is Finch Station, is a 7.4 kilometer stretch of subway track that would bring subway service to Highway 7, near Langstaff GO Station and Richmond Hills Center. And this is monumentous, as this would mark the first time a subway service is being brought to the cities of both Markham and Richmond Hill. And as the extension is proposed to terminate at an existing transit hub with GO Transit, Viva, and YRT connections, local organizers are coining this project as the Union Station of the North, which is quite ironic, as later in this episode, another Union Station of the East will be discussed. And currently it is estimated at $5.6 billion, and which is a lot more money than like the previous the Spadina extension. And yeah, it's a lot of money. And currently it only consists of 6 stations, which is roughly about 1 kilometer apart for each of them, allowing residents living along the corridor to have access within a 10-minute walk. So being how this project actually started back in 2009, when an environmental assessment and conceptual design study was actually done by the TTC, it is currently at the end of the preliminary planning, design, and engineering phase, with the governance and procurement and property acquisition starting soon. So the goal would be to begin construction in about 3 years, so 2024, and be completed and opened by 2030, which is quite aggressive.
That's a very short timeline.
Given how we're currently in a pandemic and things are not close to normal yet in Toronto, at least. What are your thoughts of this project so far?
I think even though the estimated budget of $5.6 billion is already so high, the fact that the projected timeline will only be about 6 years, I expect that dollar amount to rise a lot and be much more expensive than it already is.
Yeah, especially considering, like, when you compare it to the York Spadina extension, like, that was half the budget with the same amount of stations.
Exactly.
Pretty much similar length of stretch. So it's like, where is this money going to?
Yeah.
That's my question.
That's insane.
So things were looking great as the project seemed to be moving along well towards its 2021 preliminary design deadline until last summer in June 2020, when Metrolinx, also known as the Crown Transportation Agency of the Government of Ontario, aka the people overseeing the TTC expansion, stepped in and proposed an alternate design. So whether or not you have worked in architecture or in an urban planning office before, or simply just been in like a school group project, when someone comes in and tells you you need to change your project of a month-long like assignment the day before it's due, it's never great news. And like you only have very little time to change things. So, what are the proposed design changes? The first one and major change is actually a realignment of the subway line. So, rather than tunneling the entire length of the subway tracks, Metrolinx is proposing to elevate the extension and or veer east of Yonge as it heads towards the terminus as a way to reduce the cost of the project. So, like previously, the plan was just to go underneath Yonge Street all the way straight up to Richmond Hill, from like Finch to Richmond Hill. But because it costs a lot of money to dig underground to reach that point, their thought is to maybe, as we go north, we would go to the east a bit, so then they can follow along an existing GO corridor, and then go back to Richmond Hill. So yeah, it's a bit odd, and the reasoning for this is that despite the provincial government estimating the project to be about 5.6 billion, an unreleased report claims that the TTC actually puts the cost closer to 9.3 billion dollars, which is quite scathing.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I was correct in saying that
Yeah.
the cost would be a lot higher.
Yeah, it also begs a question to, like, how are they calculating these costs?
Yeah. Okay, wait, so question. If they're planning to veer west of Yonge Street...
Or veer east. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Veer east of Yonge Street because they don't want to do construction underground under Yonge Street.
Yes.
So this is going to be above ground?
Yes, it's going to be elevated.
So with that, without needing to dig underground and have that construction, shouldn't costs hypothetically be less because they're taking away work?
Yeah, so I guess what the report is trying to say is that the initial planned budget of 5.6 is actually supposed to be 9.3. So in order to actually get the 9.3 back to what they told the public of 5.6, they're trying to figure out ways to reduce construction costs, which tunneling is a major one of major when it comes to like creating subway lines.
Oh, so creating the elevated stations and track is a mitigation effort?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So this decision has obviously like come with a lot of backlash by both politicians and community members, as they were told and proposed an underground subway north of Toronto. So like, what are your additional thoughts of this?
I think oh man, I don't know. That's my thought.
Yeah, like for me, it's like you told me I was gonna get a subway. So I want a subway, and a subway typically happens underground when they have their own dedicated lane of traffic. But by elevating it and veering it east to join it with an existing train corridor, in my opinion, that's no longer a subway. You're just adding another train to like the GO train lane. So it's like, what's the point? What's the difference of having a subway if it's they don't have its own lane? And like by adding another train to an existing train line, it's like you're messing with their schedule too. So it's like there's a lot of question marks.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to put it. There is a lot of question marks.
Yeah, and a second proposed design change that came up this past March, actually, is to reduce the number of stations from 6 to 4. And
with the same budget in mind?
Yeah. Well, in a way to reduce from 9.3 to 5.6. Yeah. And at this time, it is unclear which stations would be cut as a part of the revised plan. But based on business analysis, it appears that no matter which one gets removed from the line, the sub extension would attract fewer daily riders, as it would leave a lot less people within a 10-minute walk of a station. Your thoughts on that?
I like what you said earlier. When you said, like, you promised me one thing, but you're giving me something else.
Yes.
I just think, so what I am thinking will happen is based on the York Spadina extension. There are going to be a lot of, okay, so based on the York Spadina extension, what I said about the issues that happened that caused the extension and caused the extension of the deadline, one of the biggest issues I think that will be the reason behind this being delayed is poor project management, because it seems like even the people working on this project aren't sure about what should happen and what could happen, which with any project, it doesn't matter what scale it's at, is a bad thing. So with something so big, it's definitely going to cause big issues.
So yeah, we shall see what will happen in the next couple of years. Will it be on time? Will it arrive early maybe, if they keep cutting things, or will it get further delayed?
Yeah. You know what? I'm actually wondering if they'll just try to sweep the whole thing under the rug and just pretend it never happened. I feel like that would be a possibility because, I don't know, it just sounds so confusing right now. And with goals to start construction in 3 years, that's not gonna happen.
Yeah, and like something that actually came up this week is that because there is this alternative design of like maybe not having the subway go underground, a lot of Thornhill residents actually have come together and grouped together in support of that, because they are being swayed by the idea that like having a subway system under their house will shake their house. And there's actually a little graphic that they have made for like a subway with a subway, and then their house, and it shatters in half because of the vibration of the subway. So there is that added public thought of the project as well, so who knows.
Okay, in terms of like the engineering behind that, like that's the part I don't understand. Is that possible? Is that a thing, or are we in a place in time where there are measures to take to prevent the shaking?
Yes, there are definitely measures.
Okay.
So I definitely do think like the Thornhill residents they're overreacting, but it's come to a surprise since they always wanted an underground subway, but then now that there is a potential alternative design, they're really like attached to that idea. So yeah, it's just interesting.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear about what happens. Okay, well now let's move on to the LRT. So earlier in the year, back in February of 2021, the TTC recommended shutting down Line 3 permanently in 2023 and replacing it with bus services, since doing a third overhaul of the line would cost a whopping $522.4 million, with a low probability of reliability being improved. So Line 3, originally known as the Scarborough RT, is the light rapid transit line that's part of the Toronto subway system. Running entirely within the suburban district of Scarborough, this line encompasses 6 stations on mostly elevated tracks. So, as we mentioned earlier, this is the above-ground tracks on the subway line. This line has remained unchanged since its opening in 1985, and the government of Toronto has been debating what to do with it since the late 2000s. Some ideas of what to do include revitalizing and expanding the line, converting its right-of-way to include use by modern light rail vehicles, or to close the line completely and extend Line 2 farther into Scarborough along a different route. In 2013, Toronto City Council ultimately decided on a 3-station extension of Line 2 to replace Line 3, but shortly after, this idea was put on halt, and in order to save money, the 3-station extension was changed to a 1-station extension. But in 2019, Premier Doug Ford stated that he was committed to completing the extension of the 3-station extension by 2030. So going back to the recommendation of shutting down Line 3 by 2023, many residents of Scarborough had become furious and frustrated as the plan left them with 7 years of alternative travel plans from the suburban area into the downtown area. While Line 3 would be removed, TTC tried to be the bigger person, and obviously they don't plan to leave Scarborough residents stranded.
Of course not.
And so they prepared to replace Line 3 with bus services instead. But let's be real, for regular commuters that relied on Line 3 to get to their destination, a 10-minute trip would now take up to 18 minutes on a replacement bus. And if you've ever been on the TTC subway during a partial closure and had to use the shuttle bus replacement, you'd understand what it's like to be part of a huge crowd all trying to squish into a much smaller vehicle and having to add more time onto your commute.
Yeah, like definitely. And I've actually been on the subway during times where there were closures or when there were suddenly like someone on a track and they had to close the line and they put out last minute bus routes, and it's quite chaotic, especially when you have to stop at a station that you've never been before or you don't frequent. You're like, where do I go? How do I get out? Where are the buses? So it's quite chaotic, especially like at the beginning of the day when you just want to get to work.
Exactly. And I think a big part of the frustration and the confusion of it all is because the bus route would be different from the subway track, obviously. So the directions and where the bus turns is going to be totally different from where the subway moves. And so as a rider that has to take a shuttle bus in replacement of the subway, that just adds to it all. So basically, with the removal of Line 3, essentially all of the regular commuters would be in this position, but, you know, for 7 years until the Line 2 extension is complete.
Some of us can't even tolerate it for one day, so 7 years is a big
Yes, exactly. So, I don't know. I'm thinking, like, hopefully there's enough people who stand up about this and say, look, if you need to take away Line 3, take it away, but you have to provide better alternatives because it just doesn't seem feasible. It doesn't make much sense to me, and I just hope they come up with a better plan for people who rely on this.
And for those who actually are interested in following along or participating in the meetings or the discussions about the Scarborough LRT, City Council is actually hosting a bunch of like Zoom town halls that you can join. So we will try to find a link for you and maybe you can join one of those. And for the last and final project of today, it is the Ontario Line. So the Ontario Line, it is what started out as a downtown relief line to the overburdened Yonge University line proposed by the City of Toronto. And once again, it took on another life of its own when the provincial government took over the project. So on April 10th, 2019, the provincial government announced that they would be doubling both the length and the cost of the original proposal call it the Ontario Line. The reason being, it is a line that would be stretching 15.6 kilometers from the Ontario Science Centre located in Midtown Toronto, curving all the way down the Don Valley towards Ontario Place, located on the western lakeshore of downtown. So you're basically like crossing the entire city. And because it's from Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place, it is Ontario Line.
You know, as someone who doesn't live in the city of Toronto, I think that is very confusing and very misleading to think, oh, finally, you know, the small towns of Ontario are finally included. But nope. No. They're not. We're not.
So the project is estimated at $10.9 billion. And this project consists of a mixture of both tunneled, at-grade, and elevated light rail systems with 15 stations. And it aims to connect the currently under construction Eglinton LRT, the Bloor-Danforth line, and the Yonge University line east of the core transit corridor. And despite it being like a relief line for the subways, according to officials, this will be a freestanding artery independent of the TTC. So it won't be owned by the TTC, just mainly managed by the TTC. Which is quite confusing as it is supposed to be a TTC subway relief line.
So with that being said, does this mean that fares will be different from regular TTC fares, or how is that going to work? Do they say anything about that?
At this moment, it is unclear, as with a lot of things. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like the province mainly wants to own the lines, but leave like the city and the TTC to operate the subway system. And even with like provincial funding, they are expecting the federal government and the city to make up the remaining $17 billion for their projects that the provincial government has not committed to. And to assist like further with funding and procurement of the project, there is a plan to transition this project into 3 smaller public-private partnership contracts, or 3Ps, as a lot of people know. And at the time of the first announcement of April 2019, the finished target is 2027, which is 6 years away. Yeah, which is only 6 years away, and considering how this project was only a recently announced project in comparison to the Young North's extension, it has a earlier completion date, which is quite interesting. And however, as expected, in 2020, Premier Ford has stated that the project completion date will most likely be delayed into 2030, which is approximately about the same time as the Young North subway station and the LRT. So, what are your thoughts on this project?
I think I have to give props to Doug Ford for, he knows that he can't complete it by 2027. So, as any responsible person would, he extended the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
But only giving it 3 years, that doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm. And further to that is they have not announced any plans of when the design phase is happening, when construction will be starting. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things up in the air, and setting a deadline for yourself to complete a whole subway line that is double in length of the other 2 projects that we just mentioned in the same amount of time is, if he can do it, is quite a feat. But the realistic side is that it probably will not happen for at least another additional 5 years to what is proposed.
I think having a target date of 2027 makes sense if that target date was for when all the designs and all the conception of everything is to be completed, and not taking into account construction of everything too. It makes sense for the plans and everything to be set out and be confirmed by 2027, because 6 years to plan everything out, that makes sense. But to add construction to that does not make sense for a 6-year timeline.
Yeah, so overall my thoughts of it, this is a very necessary build as our subways are overpacked. However, the planning behind this line is quite illogical. And some of the reasons or my questions towards the current plans are, first of all, why did the province choose to scrap a relief line that was ready to go? So the relief line that was proposed by the City of Toronto was, in all levels of government, were on board, and excavation was ready to start, and it was supposed to actually start last year.
Oh, wow.
So what was the motivation behind scrapping that ready project to start a whole different line? And secondly, why at this time of the announcement it was only the provincial government that was announcing this? So the bigger question is, why was the Ontario government out talking about investments in Toronto without the mayor of Toronto?
Yeah.
Yes, especially since you're expecting him to carry the burden of actually managing and seeing through this project as well. Another aspect of this illogical planning, in my opinion, is the path chosen. It's quite random, especially when you look at a map, and the idea of snaking through some of the most densely populated neighborhoods of the city between Midtown from the Don Valley is quite challenging to actually construct. And there's also the idea of them talking about potentially aligning this with the Lakeshore East GO corridor. However, that's an additional hurdle because the trying to add another lane into an existing GO corridor that is quite squished is another challenge itself. As well, the other question is why a mixture of tunneled and elevated? I understand that elevated may save money and time in construction, but it disregards environmental impacts such as noise, vibration, and visual presence by having an elevated subway system along the Don Valley Parkway, which is quite greenscape, minus the exception of the highway. And another fact is, like, the stations are chosen quite at random.
Okay.
And that, like, leads into my final thought is, behind the illogical planning is, as an independent line from the TTC, this new service model examined could see Ontario Line initially operating with, like, either shorter or less frequent trains than previously anticipated by the TTC, as you're using a whole different system. And also, what you mentioned earlier, or what are the costs? What are the costs to the riders? Will this be like Go Transit, where you're paying per like how many stations you take, or will it be like the TTC, where you pay one single fare for no matter how long you take it, for like within that 2-hour frame?
So many questions.
So many questions. And of course, there has been new updates.
Okay.
And the latest update is what I kind of hinted at earlier, of a transit hub called Union Station of the East. And it is, the intention behind this transit hub is to be a transit hub where commuters could access the Ontario Line, the Go Transit from the Lakeshore East Line in the future, and potentially a TTC streetcar extension, and also take pressure off of the current existing Union Station. This Union Station of the East is to be located on the current Unilever land, which is just east of Don Valley Parkway, which you can see on the highway, and is owned by the city. It is 38 acres, close to the waterfront, and has been ripe for development for many years, as it's been sitting abandoned. And the idea is to transform this place into a new transit-oriented community. So not only it is supposed to be a transit hub, but the idea is to include a major employment center that would be home to upwards of 50,000 jobs, as well as a range of residential spaces and community amenities. So this is actually one of the dozen new transit-oriented communities the Ford government intends to build as a part of a $28.5 billion subway plan that includes the Ontario Line. So what are your thoughts about this Union Station of the East? Do we need it?
No, I don't. Personally, I don't think we need it.
Or is this the right location? Is another question.
I just think there's so many things wrong with it. At this point, I don't even know if I can put my finger on what is wrong with it. I just know that there are so many things wrong with it. There's so many questions.
Like everything's wrong with it. Yeah, so like my question is like, just like the question before is like, who is your planner? Do you need a planner planner for hire? Because the Unilever land is currently an abandoned factory. So to transit an abandoned factory into a transit hub that requires a lot of underground stations or all that kind of stuff, it's like there is going to be a huge environmental assessment that needs to be taken. And because it's so close to the water, it's like you have to think about floodplains, flood lines. It's like, is this, just because this land is available, is this the right place to place it? Is, yeah, a huge question. And just adds to the further confusion of what is the Ontario Line, what is the plans, what are they doing, when are they doing it, and residents have no idea, and I think the government itself also doesn't have any idea.
Yeah, so I don't know, like I feel like a common theme for this episode is the government doesn't really know what's happening, transit agencies don't really know what's happening, the public doesn't really know what's happening. No one really knows what's happening. Yeah, except for the fact that they might be a transit expansion. They might get more stations, and they might get more subway lines. Yeah, so there's a lot of hope, which is always good. So I think the hope for everything to work out is a good note to end this on. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, and I think in order to make this hope and make all these plans and proposals a reality, and also to make it right, I recommend everyone listening to this episode to look up, to read up about what is happening, where it's happening, and if you actually live in these areas, to find the town hall meetings and participate and like share your input, because without the residents speaking up to the government and saying like, this is what we want, this is what we don't want, they will just walk all over us and do whatever they please. So if you've listened this far into the episode, the Yonge North subway extension, the LRT extension for Line 2, and the Ontario Line, those are the plans for now. Listen to our next episode to continue figuring it out with us.
Thanks for following along to this episode. If you liked it, please give us a like, review, subscribe, and for more. Until then, follow us on Instagram at What's the Plan Podcast for what the next plan is.